Appendix B, Unpacking Pre-Reflective Thought, the Hermeticism in Hegel. This appendix is written in recognition that the paper it supports would become too bogged down in an explanation of the hermetical, alchemical orientation of Hegel's philosophy, while also recognizing the importance this question has to that same discussion. It is not meant to be comprehensive. Rather, its limited goal is to focus on key features of the dialectic to meet a minimum burden of proof that demonstrates the reasonableness of the position that there is a dominant hermetic influence that informs the Hegelian dialectic and, therefore, must be incorporated into any analysis of a dialectically informed left. The archetype form the left follows is alchemy. Recognize this, and then begin foreseeably recognizing the trajectories the left sets for its courses of action. The left is driven by a dialectic that is itself hermetically inspired. Though laying camouflaged beneath the surface of perceptibility, these alchemical influences are key aspects to understanding the left's repurposed appropriation of Hegel's dialectic that manifest in the information battlespace. If not accounted for in a threat assessment structured to recognize them, they will bite, as they predictably do. This is important because some activities like interfaith, gender, race, and further otherisms follow the forced convergence imposed by hermetic archetype forms that render the underlying issues particularly vulnerable to manipulation, co-option, and absorption in the left's Aufhebender Kultur strategy. Owing to the pronounced role neo-Marxism plays in the strategic considerations of today's left, recognizing this relationship becomes especially important to a comprehensive threat analysis of the left. While the dialectical materialism of Marx and Lenin suppressed what were deemed non-essential Hegelian influences, the Institute for Social Research, the Frankfurt School, reintegrated them into the neo-Marxist dialectic when expanding the menu to include the hermetically attuned psychoanalysis of Freud, Jung, Reich, and others. Hence, the hermetic underpinnings of the Hegelian dialectic are more than simply historical or philosophical curiosities. They are important to our understanding of the left, including its ability to pull unrelated yet dialectically informed movements into its orbit. The left is the dialectic, and the dialectic is alchemy. To establish the relationship between Hermetica and the dialectic, a sentence from Meijie's Hegel and the Hermetic tradition will be decoded through the explanation of the key terms in that sentence, relying on Meijie's own treatments. Because these terms are intensely interrelated, some redundancy in citations are necessary to flesh out the separate but interdependent nature of the interplay between terms that demonstrate the dialectic's hermetic nature. The sentence, "Dialectic is the method by which speculation aims to recollect unconscious wisdom and to complete the perennial philosophy." In order, speculation, recollect, dialectic, and perennial philosophy. Philosophia perennis will be discussed. Speculation. To start, speculation comes from the Latin word speculum, meaning mirror. Hence, a speculative philosopher is one who holds a mirror up to idea in itself so it can comprehend itself. Why? Because it is through speculation that the idea becomes for itself, that God achieves self-awareness and thus completion. This completed or actualized divine is the absolute. In Hegel's theosophy, God is only God insofar as he knows himself. This self-knowledge of God becomes self-knowledge in man, and man's knowledge of God. Hence, the task of philosophy becomes the, quote, recovery and perfection of pre-reflective thought forms granted to mankind from time immemorial, unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 84. The imagery of the mirror as a symbol of speculative philosophy, as with much of the hermetic and alchemical language Hegel used, was not unique to Hegel, but rather had a developed pedigree with a defined lexicon, especially in his native Swabia. and particularly among Swabian pietist Lutherans. In his explanation of speculation, Meiji included the image of a man looking into a mirror that reflects into the clouds of undifferentiated pre-reflective thought. The man in the image is the famous alchemist, Johann Joachim Becker, who died in 1682, long before Hegel was born, 1770. The image itself is from a third edition printing of Becker's work in 1707. Hence, the imagery of the mirror to symbolize speculative thought was well developed in the theosophical communities of Hegel's time. Because speculation depends on recollection of the philosophia perennis, it is neither creative nor active. As such, true philosophy is, quote, merely a fully adequate expression of the primordial wisdom, unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 98. In the Encyclopedia Logic, Hegel states, quote, the business of philosophy consists only in bringing into consciousness explicitly what people have held to be valid about thought from time immemorial. Thus, philosophy establishes nothing new. What we have brought forth by our reflections here is what everyone already takes for granted without reflection, unquote. As such, speculative philosophy becomes the final, fully adequate, and fully conscious form of the philosophia perennis, as Hegel explains, quote, from the true knowledge of the principle of all philosophy, there will arise the conviction that at all times there has been only one and the same philosophy. So not only am I promising nothing new here, but rather am I devoting my philosophical efforts precisely to the restoration of the oldest of old things, and on liberating it from the misunderstanding in which the recent times of unphilosophy have buried it, unquote. Hegel added a mystical flavor to his treatment of, quote-unquote, speculation that resonates its hermetic influence when equating his use of the word speculation with mystical. In the Zusatzi to the Encyclopedia Logic, Hegel stated that, quote, it should be mentioned here that the meaning of the speculative is to be understood as being the same as what used in earlier times be called the mystical, unquote. In his lectures on the philosophy of religion of 1824, Hegel speaks of the Eleusinian mysteries, stating that, quote, the mystical is the speculative, what lies within, unquote. Later, he states, quote, the Trinity is called the mystery of God. Its content is mystical, i.e., speculative, unquote. In the lectures of 1827, he states that, quote, as a whole, the mystical is everything speculative, or whatever is concealed from the understanding, unquote. For Hegel, speculation is a mystical mirror that allows man to help God in himself know God or himself. Recollect, quote, Hegel believed that the truth has always been an unconscious possession of mankind. It expresses itself in different forms, at different times, and through different thinkers. The philosopher recollects this unconscious wisdom and expresses it in a fully adequate form, unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 244. Unconscious wisdom, then, is the philosophia perennis that is recollected in speculative philosophy. Hegel also expressed recollection in terms of memory. For example, in On Mythology, the Spirit of the People, and Art, Hegel spoke of mnemosony, memory, being the, quote, absolute muse, unquote. Quote, the work of art of mythology propagates itself in living tradition. As peoples grow in the liberation of their consciousness, so the mythological work of art continuously grows and clarifies and matures. This work of art is a general possession, the work of everyone. Each generation hands it down embellished to the one that follows. Each works further toward the liberation of absolute consciousness, unquote. Hence, quote, mnemosony, memory, or recollection, is the mother of the muse of the poet, the artist, and the philosopher. She is their access to primordial wisdom, knowledge of the whole. All three may hear her voice and express her wisdom in their own ways. Through her voice, the philosopher can learn to speak the truly complete and adequate speech, which is speculation, the speech of the absolute. Unquote. Dialectic. Why should we believe in the existence of a philosophia perennis, an unconscious wisdom, only accessible through the passive act of recollection in a process of speculation? Because, as Meiji argues, quote, all philosophy is implicitly or explicitly dialectical in nature, and the activity of the dialectic presupposes that one always already possesses wisdom, but in inchoate form. The dialectic is a recollection and explication of that wisdom. Unquote. Because the hermetic construct is the archetype dialectical form underlying Hegel's cosmology. Hence, it is also the first most important way to understand all dialectical forms emanating from Hegel, including the left's. Quote, the key to the dialectic is that the participants already know, in some sense, the meaning of the terms they aim at defining. In the same manner, each category of Hegel's logic constitutes a provisional definition of the absolute, but each proves partial and inadequate, forcing us to inquire further, and so the dialectic pushes on. Unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 89-90. This pushing on, the forward movement of history, is nothing other than the ongoing hermetical quest to reform the undifferentiated idea, the pre-reflective thought, in the absolute. Hence, we can never be, quote, content with being, or with being for itself, or with the measureless, or with identity, because we experience a disparity between each category and what we somehow already know the idea to be. Unquote. As Hegel stated in 1810 in the Difference essay, quote, what the so-called common sense takes to be the rational consists similarly of single items drawn out of the absolute into consciousness. They are points of light that arise out of the night of totality and aid men to get through life in an intelligent way. In fact, however, men only have this confidence in the truth of these points of light because they have a feeling of the absolute attending these points. Unquote. Quote, Hegel's dialectic is a recollection of what our finite individual spirit has somehow already glimpsed of absolute spirit. Unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 90. Through a speculative philosophy that recollects the philosophia perennis, the, quote, presuppositions of philosophy, unquote, Hegel wrote, are, quote, the absolute itself, the goal that is being sought, but it is already immanently present, or how otherwise could it be sought, unquote. In Genesis and Structure of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Jean Hippolyte brought the dialectic closer to the more familiar construction. Quote, in our opinion, if we are to understand Hegel's dialectic, we must assume that the whole is always immanent in the development of consciousness. Negation is creative because the posited term had been isolated and thus was itself a kind of negation. From this it follows that the negation of that term allows the whole to be recaptured in each of its parts. Were it not for the immanence of the whole in consciousness, we should be unable to understand how negation can truly engender a content. We have evidence of the immanence of the whole in consciousness in the teleological nature of the latter's development. The goal of knowledge is fixed as necessarily as the series of progressions. Unquote. As the undifferentiated gold of pre-reflective thought transitions to nature, it shatters into flecks of gold that then become infused and hidden in every aspect of nature. Just as the flecks of gold embedded in the impure muck of nature seek alchemical liberation, leading to their convergence with other liberated flecks, so too does thought, The dialectic seeks the whole. As Hippolyte suggests, because the absolute idea portrays a hermetic understanding of God, transcendence is traded for immanence, thus immanentizing the eschaton. In fact, not only is God made immanent, he is made dependent on man for his own self-knowing and ultimate actualization. For Hegel, such an intellectual achievement can only occur when history comes to an end and people recognize that they are, quote, free and not determined by an absolute that stands opposed to humanity as an absolute other. The final form of wisdom is necessarily a self-conscious form. The absolute idea achieves full realization or disclosure through humanity's explicit recognition of itself as the agent of the idea's consummation. Unquote. As Meiji later explains, quote, the logic represents God in himself. God expresses himself through the forms of nature, but only returns to himself and achieves self-knowing through spirit, through human knowing. The philosopher thus serves to actualize or complete God, because God qua absolute idea, God in himself, is conceived of as abstract and lacking realization in the world. It follows that God's progressive and worldly incarnation involves a progressive increase in concreteness and embodiment. In the lectures on the philosophy of religion, Hegel states that, quote, spirit is the most concrete sense. The absolute or highest being belongs to it. Unquote. This dialectic seeks the total reformation of the whole at the end point of history, what Teilhard calls the omega point, God. It achieves this through, quote, recollection of the whole, which it aims to fully articulate, unquote. As the dialectic progresses through history, the individual categories, which are always provisional definitions of the absolute, prove inadequate because they cannot fully express our recollected intuition of what the whole is. Philosophia Perennis, Pieper's pseudo-reality, Vogelin's second reality, and the Matrix's blue pill are all characterizations of Hegel's realized Philosophia Perennis, which is itself a hermetic concept. Let's take a look. Establishing or re-establishing the perennial philosophy is the objective of the dialectic. It is not simply a pure philosophical thought form from time immemorial. Rather, it is the eternal philosophy from which all philosophical, religious, and artistic thoughts draw whatever can be true from the imperfect manifestations, the particular, of the eternally true, the universal. They all fall short of the whole, as they all must, and will continue to do so until the absolute fully manifests at the end of history. Why? Because, until that time, all they can be are particular moments among the current bundle of concepts, imperfect manifestations that nature gleans through speculation of the universal they seek. Like the flecks of gold embedded in the impure muck of nature, they seek alchemical liberation, leading to their convergence with the other liberated flecks. This is accomplished through a process that moves forward to the absolute spirit, to the self-thinking thought, to Teilhard's omega point God. As Hegel put it, quote, if the absolute, like reason, which is its appearance, is eternally one and the same, as indeed it is, then every reason that is directed toward itself and comes to recognize itself produces a true philosophy and solves for itself the problem which, like its solution, is at all times the same. Unquote. Philosophia Perennis is a hermetic concept that, as suggested, holds that, quote, all previous systems of thought aim at and partially unveil the same doctrine, unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 86. For Hegel, this means that, quote, speculative philosophy is the final, fully adequate, and fully conscious form of the Philosophia Perennis, which can only be accomplished in modern times, unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 86. Reprising the same quote used to explain speculation, when Hegel spoke of the oldest of old things, he was referring to the perennial philosophy. Quote, "From the true knowledge of the principle of all philosophy, there will arise the conviction that at all times there has been only one and the same philosophy. So not only am I promising nothing new here, but rather am I devoting my philosophical efforts precisely to the restoration of the oldest of old things, and on liberating it from the misunderstanding in which the recent times of unphilosophy have buried it." Unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 86. Because Hegel believed the task of philosophy to be the recovery and perfection of pre-reflective thought forms from time immemorial, the true role of philosophy becomes a passive, uncreative search for fully adequate expressions of the perennial philosophy. As this primordial wisdom belongs to the unconsciousness of the people, it includes art and religion as well as philosophy. Where it underlies religion and folk consciousness, quote, philosophy can be popular and even religious, unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 84. Consistent with perennial philosophy, Hegel believed that, quote, a primitive Oriental monism runs symbolically through all true religion, expressed in Indian mysticism, preserved in Greek mysteries, lying behind classical Greek polytheism, implicit in classical theism, and coming to self-expression in Hegel's concept of the absolute as the infinite incarnation, unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 85. Adjusting the Philosophia Perennis to narrow in on just religion, if one looks at the arc that perennial philosophy forms from the single, undifferentiated whole at the primordial start point to the many religions at or near the apogee today, then the role of speculative philosophy becomes the convergence of those religions as part of the effort to move history forward. In archetype form, this is the pattern the interfaith movement follows. The left loves it because it recognizes that, being dialectical, the interfaith movement is not only relentlessly statist, its very process will collapse whatever faith falls within its ambit. The Islamic movement loves it because it recognizes the collapse the dialectical process will induce, knows it is dealing with either agnostics and cynics in collars or witless fools in collars, and oftentimes both, as it prepares for the day when the faith-deprived will seek emphatic alternatives. On the question of religion, Hegelian concepts of primordial wisdom conflict with Judeo-Christian notions owing to the Hermetic preference for immanence over transcendence. The distinctions between the two are non-trivial, civilization-defining or redefining, and easy to demonstrate. Whereas, in the Hermetic, primordial wisdom is inherent in nature, and therefore organically immanent in the minds of men. In the Judeo-Christian schema, it is the transcendent God who is, quote, the eternal, there is no change, unquote, Malachi 3:6, who, quote, puts his law within them and writes it on their hearts, unquote. As Hegel stated in the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, quote, God is God only so far as he knows himself. His self-knowledge is, further, a self-consciousness in man and man's knowledge of God, which proceeds to man's self-knowledge in God, unquote. This view is roundly rejected in the Judeo-Christian construct, at least as far back as Isaiah's declaration that, quote, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, said the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts, unquote. Isaiah 55, 8-9. Establishing continuity with the Old Testament, St. Paul carried Isaiah forward to the New, quote, for the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men, unquote. 1 Corinthians 1:25, and, quote, for the wisdom of this world is folly with God. For it is written, He catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile. Unquote. 1 Corinthians 3:19 through 20. Lined up alongside Hegel, the biblical passages not only highlight the hermetic typology underlying the Hegelian dialectic, but also that this typological form has deep historical roots. The two concepts of God are mutually exclusive. In the Hegelian context, they are antithetical. Additionally, in the Judeo-Christian view, God is the creator, nature is his creation. God is not his creation. When pondering the transcendent God in creation, God is recognized through his creation in the same way that Leonardo da Vinci is recognized through the Mona Lisa he painted. The artist is known by his art. In the transcendent concept of God, as above is not as below, at least not in the hermetic sense. Perhaps nowhere does the Judeo-Christian schema more directly repudiate hermetic concepts than in the Old Testament Septuagint's Book of Wisdom. Written in Koine Greek around 200 to 175 BC in Alexandria, Egypt, the Book of Wisdom affirms the distinction between the creator and the created before claiming 3 of the 4 alchemical elements, along with the heavens, to be among God's creations. Quote, For all men who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable, from the good things that are seen, to know him who exists, nor did they recognize the craftsman, while paying heed to his works. But they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air, or the circle of the stars, or turbulent water, of the luminaries of heaven, were the gods that rule the world. Unquote. Wisdom 13:1 and 2. Alexandria is the birthplace and home of Hermeticism. It is in the context of making space for the imminent that demands for Big Ten inclusion by interfaith contingents within the various faith communities should be understood. Offhaven. But there is something more. As a nation, America was founded on the idea that man was endowed with inalienable rights. To be endowed is to be freely furnished or provided something. Like a gift, it is unearned. You cannot give yourself what you already have. God endowed man with inalienable rights because man is the imago Dei. He is made in the image of God. This is not a religious commentary, but rather a statement of historical fact concerning the nature of the proposition the Declaration of Independence proposed. It is what the nation was formed around, that a constitution was crafted to put in effect. By virtue of being placed in the dialectic, it is also what the perennial philosophy seeks to negate. An erroneous idea has metastasized that America can be defended outside the scope of the Declaration's proposition, that the Constitution can defend rights other than those endowed by the Creator. But rights not granted by the Creator can only be privileges granted by the state, or by those who otherwise have the might to make right. This turn of events approached the fait accompli at about the time that Wilson successfully traded Newton for Darwin, that is, when he successfully traded rights endowed by the Creator with privileges granted by the Hegelian state. One thing is certain. On the current dialectical trajectory, there is no outcome where the Declaration's concept of America survives. The Philosophia Perennis in actual act is premised on an offhaven America. With Gnosticism nascently on the rise, along with other related ancient Mediterranean beliefs, there are reasons to know that St. Paul was in direct contact with similar, if not the same beliefs, when adopting hardline responses that emphasized transcendence. Hence, in Romans 1:19 through 21, Paul wrote that God makes himself known through his creation, so that there is no excuse for not knowing him. And since they do know him and do not honor him, they are rendered futile in their thinking and darkened in their senses. How easy it is to see in Paul's statement a direct refutation of what today manifests as the dialectic. The battle between immanence and transcendence is itself a perennial struggle that is as old as Elijah's warnings to Ahab and the people of Israel to make a choice between Baal and God, as stated in 1 Kings 18:21. Later, in Romans 2:14 through 16, St. Paul said that because God wrote the law in their hearts, they know it, and this is what their conscience bears witness to when their conflicting thoughts accuse or excuse them. Under the Judeo-Christian schema, a perennial philosophy is not embedded in the minds of man to be remembered, but provided to him. There is an amicable overlap between Philosophia Perennis and the concept of the Precious Theologia that comes into play when considering the role the interfaith movement plays. In the context of this discussion, the two are interoperable for obvious reasons. Precious Theologia holds, quote, that there is one true trans-denominational, trans-cultural theology, an account of the divine being revealed by God to man in the remote past, unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 52. The influence perennial philosophy has on religion can also be understood in terms of the Precious Theologia. As such, the archetype theology of the interfaith movement is that of the eminently inspired Precious Theologia that likewise seeks the restoration of the, quote, one true, trans-denominational, trans-cultural theology, unquote. Standing in for the Precious Theologia, the dialectical objective of the interfaith movement is the securing of a transition from transcendence to immanence in the Judeo-Christian schema in furtherance of implementing a converged replacement theology in the Western religions that it penetrates. Far from being an innocuously rarefied philosophical or theological or academic debate, interfaith efforts should be understood as the ongoing overriding of the Judeo-Christian foundations of Western civilization through a repeating series of dialectical turns in furtherance of, quote-unquote, restoring the Philosophia Perennis. From 19th century Prussian Protestant hermeneutics, a la Wellhausen, JEDP, Quigge, etc., that hermetically sealed the Bible in a hermetic bubble, to the covert Hermeticism of the Jesuits, a la Teilhard and Balthasar, that informed Vatican II theologians in the 20th, the inability to recognize, let alone appreciate, the dialectic's relentless penetration of the Western institutions of faith is remarkable. As it relates to the left, while one should expect to find scientized emulations of the Hermetic Philosophia Perennis as a general proposition, the left will be satisfied with the negation its pursuit entails. Can you spot the association? Marx's critical philosophy, the Frankfurt School's critical theory, and the biblical higher criticism, or historical criticism. Before moving on, there is another aspect of the Hegelian metaphysic that concerns the religious overtones that the Hegelian dialectic exudes. For example, Meiji said that because, quote, the speculative philosopher is not in control of his thoughts, unquote, he becomes, quote, enthralled by what he is thinking about, unquote. Arthur Schopenhauer, a contemporary critic of Hegel and a Buddhist, recognized the quasi-religious aspects of Hegel's philosophy when declaring it to be a, quote, parody of scholastic realism, a monster that is supposed to represent Christianity turned inside out, unquote. Bertrand Russell believed much of Hegel's philosophy was little more than the, quote, intellectualizing of what had first appeared to him as a mystic insight, unquote, in his youth. Hegel for Beginners, from the Marxist Internet Archive, speaks of a religious-like euphoria, the sense that comes when, quote, the movement of thought coincides with a vision of harmony that awaits us in the end, unquote, such that, quote, every serious reader of Hegel can bear witness to the intoxication, unquote. And, progressing to Marxism, former CPUSA leader Belladod's testimony that, quote, communism is like a religion, unquote, while Antonio Gramsci declared that, quote, socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity, unquote. Regardless of the form the dialectic assumes, it has demonstrated an ability to instill an intense, ideologically centered, true faith cadre that rivals that of bona fide religious faiths. Many characterize Hegel's quasi-religious overtones in mystical terms. For example, Schopenhauer called Hegel's so-called philosophy, quote, a colossal piece of mystification, unquote, while Russell believed that Hegel's philosophy was simply an quote-unquote intellectual elaboration of his, quote, early interest in mysticism, unquote, that sustained, quote, a belief in the unreality of separateness, unquote. Hegel confirmed the mysticism in his philosophy when declaring, on multiple occasions, that, quote, it should be mentioned here that the meaning of the speculative is to be understood as being the same as what used in earlier times be called the mystical, unquote. Hegel said that the speculative philosophy that drives his dialectic is mysticism. Mysticism generally refers to Hermeticism. As Meiji stated, quote, Hermeticism is also sometimes called theosophy, or esotericism. Less precisely, it is often characterized as mysticism, unquote. Returning to Schopenhauer, he believed Hegel's mystical philosophy to be a, quote, pseudo-philosophy that paralyzed all mental powers, stifling all real thinking, unquote. Eric Vogelin admitted that he didn't understand Hegel until learning that Hegel's contemporaries viewed him as a Gnostic thinker. Russell affirmed Vogelin's Gnostic finding when explaining Hegel's spirit in Gnostic terms. Quote, the nature of spirit may be understood by contrasting it with its opposite, namely matter. The essence of matter is gravity. The essence of spirit is freedom, unquote. It was in trying to make sense of Hegel's self-declaration in the Phenomenology that the Phenomenology was a work of magic, that Vogelin traced Hegel's steps from Gnosticism through Neoplatonism to Hermeticism. As Vogelin stated, quote, Hegel's program of magic, I would now say, belongs to the continuous history of modern Hermeticism since the 15th century, unquote. Hegel stated that his dialectic advances linguistically through a formula of magic words. Quote, every individual is a blind link in the chain of the absolute necessity along which the world develops. Every individual can raise himself to domination over a great length of the chain only if he realizes the goal of this great necessity and, by virtue of this knowledge, learns to speak the magic words which evoke its shape. The knowledge of how to simultaneously absorb and elevate oneself beyond the world and all forms of its development for thousands of years. This knowledge can be gathered from philosophy alone, unquote. Rosenkranz, Hegel's Leben, 141. Meiji recognized that Hegel's magic words are, quote, the categories of the Hegelian philosophy. The magic power is dialectic guided by recollection, unquote. The magic words are the incantations of the mystical, which Hegel says is the speculative philosophy, which is the, quote, knowledge to absorb and elevate, unquote, in the coded language that drives the dialectic. Of course, magic words are incantations and spells. A book of incantations and spells is called a grimoire. The incantations of a hermeticist conjure up the spells of a magician or sorcerer. Entitling his article on Hegel, A Study in Sorcery, Vogelin was perfectly serious about the hermetic role Hegel cast for himself in the execution of his philosophy, and as such, Vogelin's characterizations are descriptively accurate. This is why Vogelin declared Hegel's phenomenology a grimoire. Quote, philosophy becomes the grimoire of the magician who will evoke for everybody the shape of the reconciliation that for himself he cannot achieve in the reality of his existence, unquote. Russell seemed to agree with Vogelin's assessment when stating that for Hegel's philosophy of history to succeed, quote, some distortion of facts and considerable ignorance, unquote, are required. Vogelin believed that Hegel's grimoire remains an ongoing dedication to the, quote, violent destruction of reality, unquote. Grimoires are written in magic code, which the reader, if he does not want to be taken in, must decipher. To be taken in by a grimoire is to be under its spell. Do Meiji's enthralled or the Marxist Internet Archive's intoxication qualify? Schopenhauer would think so. Declaring Hegel's dialectic to be both mind-destroying Hegelism and an extravagant maze of words, such as had previously only been heard in madhouses, Schopenhauer, as early as the 1840s, was greatly alarmed over the effect the dialectic was having on an entire generation of Germans that, among other things, rendered them particularly vulnerable to Marxism, materialism. Quote, the brains of the present generation of savants are disorganized by the Hegelian nonsense, incapable of reflection, coarse and bewildered. They fall prey to the low materialism, unquote. Bertrand Russell likewise pondered over the influence that Hegel's magic words cast over its followers. Quote, Hegel's philosophy is so odd that one would not have expected him to be able to get sane men to accept it. But he did. He set it out with so much obscurity that people thought it must be profound. It can easily be expounded lucidly in words of one syllable, but then its absurdity becomes obvious, unquote. This drill down on the theosophical religiosity that the dialectic inspires reveals a self-awareness of Hermeticism on Hegel's part that makes it entirely reasonable to analyze his dialectic along alchemical lines, and arguably unreasonable not to at least account for it. Applying a strict construction to the terms that define the meaning and content of a sentence according to its own lexical use, the hermetic nature of the dialectic is exposed. Read in this manner, the sentence offered at the beginning of this drill down could be restated as follows, quote, the dialectic, a process that is controlled by magic words, is the method by which speculation, the mysticism that informs the magic words, aims to recollect the unconscious wisdom of the Philosophia Perennis that is imminently, yet incompletely infused into our subconscious in furtherance of reconstituting the perennial philosophy as the absolute act that, when accomplished, replaces Western civilization through the same dialectical process that alchemists try to use to convert lead into gold, unquote. Meiji, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, 90.